Was he out of his mind? That's what the paramedic actually shouted at me right before I climbed back through that shattered window a second time. Smoke was pouring off the hood. Somebody behind me was screaming that the tank could blow any second, and honestly, at that point, I couldn't have told you if I cared. The strange part is that 3 hours earlier, all I'd wanted in this world was somebody to answer a text message. I'd just come from my brother's memorial service in Beaufort, South Carolina. My name is Walter Hutchins. I'm 64 years old, retired now from 31 years running the maintenance department at a regional hospital in Charlotte, and for most of my life, I was the man who fixed things and stayed out of photographs. My brother Ray was 2 years younger than me, and losing him felt like losing the only other person alive who remembered our mother's voice. I flew down for the service, sat through it alone since my wife passed back in 2019, and flew home that same evening because I didn't want to spend one more night in a hotel room grieving by myself. I landed in Charlotte a little after 6. I texted my son Marcus and my daughter Renee in our family group thread. Just landed. Long day. Either of you around to grab me from the airport? I sat there staring at my phone in my lap while the other passengers filed past me down the aisle, because nobody was rushing to get anywhere for my sake. Marcus answered first. Kinda swamped with the kids tonight, Pop. Just grab an Uber, it's not a big deal. Renee texted a minute after that. Dad, you know we've got that thing with Todd's parents tonight. You should have told us your flight time earlier so we could plan. I looked at that word, plan, for longer than I care to admit. As if grief came with a calendar invite. As if burying my only brother should have fit somewhere between dinner reservations and a school recital. I could have told them I'd just watched Ray's casket lowered into red Carolina clay that morning. Instead, I typed back 2 words. No worries. Then I put the phone face down on the tray table, because I finally understood something I probably should have understood years earlier. You cannot make people show up for you. You can only decide how much that's going to cost you going forward. Charlotte greeted me with a light rain and the ordinary noise of an airport at dusk, families hugging at the curb, horns blaring, life carrying on exactly the way it always does, completely indifferent to the fact that mine had just cracked straight down the middle for the second time in 4 years. I wheeled my one suitcase toward the pickup lane. My back ached, not from the flight, from 3 nights of maybe 2 hours of sleep each, sitting up in a hotel chair because lying down felt too much like giving in. Near the curb, a young mother was wrestling a stroller and 2 duffel bags at the same time, and I walked over without thinking twice and got the stroller folded down for her. She thanked me, said she hoped somebody would return the favor for me one of these days. I told her I hoped so too. That's when the night came apart behind us. A delivery van had run the red light at the terminal exit and clipped a minivan broadside, and before anyone could react, 2 more cars piled into the wreck trying to brake. Metal shrieked against metal. A fuel line somewhere caught, and smoke started rolling up thick and black against the rain. One sedan had spun sideways into the median barrier. The minivan itself was on fire near the engine block, and it was rocking because somebody inside was still moving. People around me froze. A few had their phones up already, filming instead of moving. Somebody grabbed my jacket sleeve and told me not to go near it. I pulled loose anyway. Years back, before the hospital gave me the maintenance job, I did 11 years as a volunteer firefighter out of a rural station in Union County, structure fires mostly. A couple of highway wrecks nobody wanted to talk about afterward. Instinct got there before fear had a chance to weigh in. I left my suitcase sitting right there on the sidewalk and ran for the minivan. A teenage girl was pinned behind the wheel, her little brother screaming in a car seat in the back, and the smell of gasoline was thick enough that I could taste it on the back of my tongue. Somebody behind me yelled that it could go up any second. Maybe it could. That family didn't have the luxury of waiting around to find out which way that bet landed. I grabbed a fire extinguisher some stranger had run over from a nearby car and swung the base of it into the driver's window once, twice. On the 3rd swing, the glass finally gave. I want to be straight with you about something, because I think it's the part of stories like this people scroll right past. Everybody likes to believe they'd be brave in a moment like that. But standing there, it wasn't bravery, not really. It was just what was left over once grief had already burned away everything else in me that used to be afraid of things. Cover your face, I told the girl, sweeping the last of the glass off the seat with my forearm while the sirens were still somewhere far off, still too far away to matter yet. Kneeling there with blood running down my wrist and into my sleeve, all I could think was one plain thing. Ray would never have forgiven me if I stood on that curb and let some other family lose each other the same week I'd lost him. A police officer reached me and told me to get back behind the tape. I pointed instead at the sedan against the median, where a hand was still pressed flat against the inside of the cracked windshield, still moving. He didn't wait around arguing with me. He sent 2 firefighters running that direction instead. That's when I noticed my own hands were shaking, cuts across both palms, my sleeve scorched black at the cuff. None of it had registered until the adrenaline finally let go of me. 40 minutes later, the scene was more or less contained. An officer with a clipboard asked my name. Walter Hutchins, I told him, 64. He looked at me a second too long, said I ought to be sitting in one of those ambulances getting looked at. I told him I'd had worse. He almost smiled and said every man over 60 tells him that. The word brother would have hit different a week earlier. Now it landed on me like one more collision. I told him I'd buried mine that same morning, and I watched whatever was left of his smile go away completely. Witnesses kept interrupting the officer's questions. A man in scrubs said he'd watched me go back toward the wreck twice, while everyone else stood there filming it on their phones. A woman backed him up, said the firefighters only made it to the sedan in time, because I'd bought them a couple of extra minutes nobody else was willing to buy. I wasn't counting minutes. I just saw people who needed somebody. A young EMT cleaned the glass out of my palms and asked if family was coming to pick me up. I told her they were busy tonight. She didn't push on it, just handed me a bottle of water and said she hoped somebody was giving me a ride home. So did I. A local reporter named Carla Jimenez came over with a cameraman trailing behind her and asked if I'd answer a couple of questions. I told her I really wasn't interested in being on the news. She said the fire crews were telling her 3 people would likely have died without me getting there first. I told her I was just glad everybody made it and that was really all I had to say about it. She nodded and actually backed off without pushing further, which surprised me. Ray always respected people who could hear the word no and just leave it alone. I remember thinking Carla Jimenez might be one of those rare ones. Because the roads around the airport stayed shut down for hours, an officer drove me the rest of the way to a small extended-stay hotel a few exits off the interstate, the beige, forgettable kind built for stranded travelers. I checked in, set Ray's old army duffel bag on the dresser, the one his daughter had insisted I take home with me, a flannel shirt of his folded inside that he'd never once worn in the last 10 years, and I sat on the edge of that bed holding it against my chest, breathing in whatever was left of him in the fabric. That's when I finally broke down. Not over the accident, not over my hands. Over the plain fact that there would never again be a phone call from Ray asking if my flight had landed safe. Across town, my son had no idea where I even was. Marcus had just put his kids to bed when his phone started going off. A neighbor first, then a coworker, then his own supervisor. "Turn on Channel 9 right now," his supervisor said, and hung up before Marcus could even ask why. The footage was already looping on repeat. A gray-haired man in a scorched jacket climbing back through a shattered window a second time. His wife Angela went pale before Marcus had even finished processing what he was looking at. "Is that your dad?" she whispered. He couldn't get words out. His throat had closed up completely. Across the city, my daughter Renee got almost the same call, from her friend Denise this time. "I think your father's on every station in Charlotte right now," Denise told her. Renee laughed it off at first, until she turned the television on herself and had to sit straight down on the arm of the couch. Then the anchor read a detail that stopped her cold. Walter Hutchins had reportedly flown back into Charlotte that same evening, following his brother's funeral down in Beaufort. She'd been so buried under work deadlines and Todd's family obligations that she hadn't spared one single thought all evening for what that quiet flight home must have felt like for me. I want to pause on that for a second, because I think it matters more than the fire or the broken glass ever did. Most people like to believe they'd never say something like, "You should have told us earlier," to a grieving parent. But burnout doesn't announce itself either. It just quietly steers your attention clean away from the people who need it most, until a stranger's video finally forces you to look straight at it. My phone stayed face down on that hotel nightstand the entire night. I never felt it buzzing, never saw the missed calls stacking up, 30-some of them by morning. For the first time in longer than I could remember, everybody suddenly wanted to know exactly where I was. I woke a little before 6. For a few peaceful seconds I forgot everything. Forgot I was in a hotel and not my own bed. Forgot Ray was gone. Forgot the fire and the glass entirely. Then it all came rushing back at once, the way it does every single morning now, like the floor giving out from under a chair you'd gotten used to sitting in. I left the television off. I'd spent 30 years quietly fixing broken boilers and busted pipes at that hospital without anybody making a fuss over it, and recognition had never once been the point for me. Around 8, there was a knock at my door. It was Carla Jimenez, looking almost apologetic about it. The front desk manager had recognized me off the morning broadcast. She said she wasn't there to shove a camera in my face again. She just had a message from the hospital. The teenage girl I'd pulled out of that minivan was going to pull through fine. Her mother wanted me to know she kept asking about the man who broke the window. I actually laughed for the first time in days. Told Carla I imagined that girl's mother was also telling her never to try climbing through broken glass herself. Carla smiled and mentioned there were about 15 reporters camped out by the front entrance. I asked her to keep my location to herself. She gave me her word on it, and for the first time since any of this started, I believed there was still such a thing as decent journalism left in this business. Meanwhile, Marcus and Renee met outside my house at 7 that morning, using the spare key I'd given Marcus years back for emergencies. Everything sat exactly the way I'd left it. My recliner angled toward the window, my work boots lined up by the garage door, no smell of coffee brewing because my wife Sandra used to be the one who beat me out of bed every morning to make a pot, and some habits just die slower than the person who started them. Renee noticed a small cedar box sitting on the mantel that she'd honestly never paid attention to before. Neither of them said a word for almost a full minute. The quiet in that house was louder than anything either one of them had said to each other in a long time. "We should probably straighten up before Dad gets home," Renee finally said, mostly because it gave her hands something to do besides shake. While she was dusting the bookshelf, she found an old shoebox tucked behind some photo albums that neither of them had ever noticed before. Inside were folded letters and 4 spiral notebooks, each one labeled with a year in Sandra's careful handwriting, the kind of handwriting you'd know anywhere even a decade after somebody's gone. "I don't think we should be reading these," Renee said. "I think Mom would have wanted us to," Marcus answered, though honestly he wasn't sure of that either. The early pages were ordinary enough. Birthdays, a family vacation to the coast, small complaints about a neighbor's dog. Then one entry stopped them both cold. Sandra had written that I'd quietly sold my old base boat to help cover Marcus's first down payment on his house, and made her swear never to tell him why, because Marcus would never have taken the money if he'd known where it came from. Marcus went pale. "No," he said out loud. "He told me he just wasn't fishing anymore." Renee turned another page and found an entry about her divorce from her first husband, how I'd pulled money straight out of my retirement account to cover her attorney, then told both kids we'd simply decided it was time to downsize the house. "I actually thought we wanted somewhere smaller," she said, one hand pressed flat over her mouth. They kept reading, entry after entry. Me taking on weekend maintenance contracts after I'd already retired, not out of boredom the way I always claimed, but because Marcus's little HVAC business had nearly gone under that first year. Me holding off on a new truck for 6 years running because Renee's son needed a tutor she couldn't afford on her own. Me skipping 2 family cruises because tuition kept climbing faster than anybody expected. Never once complaining, never once bringing it up again. Then Renee found an entry from only 5 months back and read it out loud, her voice cracking somewhere in the middle of it. Sandra had written about Ray's last round of treatment down in Beaufort, how I'd emptied nearly everything left in our savings account without hesitating for even a second, how I'd smiled the whole time, signing the paperwork so nobody would see what it was actually costing me. She'd closed the entry hoping that if she wasn't around to say it herself one day, her children would never mistake my quiet for indifference, that underneath all of it was the biggest heart she'd ever known in a person. Marcus sat down hard on the bottom stair, elbows on his knees, shoulders shaking. "I thought Dad was just tight with money," he said. "So did I," Renee answered quietly. Neither of them had ever once wondered why I still drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it, or wore the same jacket every winter, or always said I was doing just fine whenever anybody asked. Around noon, Marcus's wife Angela showed up with sandwiches from the deli and immediately sensed something was wrong the second she walked in. She read 2 pages of one notebook and sat down beside her husband without saying another word about it. "I told him to just grab an Uber," Marcus said quietly. "My uncle just died and I told my own father to grab an Uber." Across the city, I sat alone on a bench along the Catawba River, the same river Sandra used to say reminded her that life was always carrying somebody home to somewhere, whether they felt ready for it or not. My phone rang. This time I actually picked it up. For several seconds Marcus couldn't get a single word out. Finally, through tears, 4 words. "Dad, please come home. Dad." Words I would have given almost anything to hear 24 hours earlier. Words that landed about a day too late to feel the way they should have felt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask him what had suddenly changed his mind. I just told him I wasn't ready yet. And I ended the call, not to punish him, but because some things need a little room to breathe before they can hold forgiveness without cracking straight back open under the weight of it. I spent the rest of that afternoon walking along the river. Ferries drifted by slow and easy. A couple of college kids threw a frisbee near the fountain. Street musicians played like nothing in the world had changed, because for them, nothing had. Sandra used to say, "The world just keeps on turning, whether or not the rest of us feel ready to keep walking alongside it." That afternoon, I honestly wasn't sure I still remembered how. Carla called again that evening, not for an interview this time, she said up front. Just to pass along that the mayor's office wanted to give me some kind of recognition, and so did the fire department, and so did the hospital administration where I used to work. I told her I wasn't interested in any of that. She said she understood completely. But there was one more thing she wanted to ask. She wanted to tell the story the right way, because every station in town was already calling me a hero and inventing their own reasons why I'd been standing alone at that curb in the first place. "They don't need to know all of it," I told her. "I think maybe they do," she said back. "Loneliness is something a lot more people understand than heroism ever will." Then she told me her own mother had passed away alone in an assisted living facility during the pandemic, and she never once got the chance to say a proper goodbye. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. I agreed to one interview. No politics involved, no dramatic music playing underneath it, and if I didn't care for a question, I didn't have to answer it. She agreed to every part of that. We filmed it the next morning in a quiet little conference room at the hospital. Just 2 folding chairs and a single camera. She asked me why I kept running back toward the wreck a second time. I told her that after 36 years loving one person, and now losing the last piece of my own family besides my children, fear just stops carrying the same weight it used to. You stop asking whether something's dangerous and you start asking only whether somebody needs you right now. Then she asked me the question I already knew was coming. Did my family know I was flying home that night? I had every reason in the world in that moment to just tell the plain truth. I could have let an entire viewing audience sit in judgment of my own children the same way I judged them alone in that hotel room the night before. Instead, I said, "They've got busy lives." I told her they were raising kids of their own and juggling jobs and family obligations, more than I ever had to juggle back at their age, so of course they couldn't make it out that night. Carla studied me for a long moment. "You don't sound angry about it," she said. "I've had about enough sadness this week already," I told her. Didn't need to go stacking anger right on top of it. That one sentence, "they've got busy lives," is the part that ended up going everywhere. Not the fire, not the glass. That sentence because something like 80,000 people apparently saw themselves reflected right back in it. One woman wrote that her own mother said that exact same phrase every single time she forgot to call and check in on her. Somebody else wrote that they'd booked a flight home that very same night after watching it. Marcus watched the interview alone in his truck in a parking lot and just put his face down in his hands. Renee watched it from her couch while her youngest climbed up beside her and asked, innocent as anything, why Grandpa was saying such nice things about people who'd hurt his feelings. Renee didn't have an answer ready for that. Most grown adults wouldn't have either. That night, my porch quietly filled up with flowers and handwritten notes from neighbors I barely knew by name. Somebody mowed my lawn without ever ringing the doorbell. Somebody else weeded Sandra's old flower beds along the walkway. Nobody announced any of it. They just went ahead and did it, the same way I'd apparently been quietly helping out around that neighborhood for close to 20 years without anybody paying it much mind. When I finally drove home that night, 2 folding chairs sat waiting for me out on the porch. Marcus in one, Renee in the other. Neither one of them looking down at a phone screen. Neither of us moved for a long moment once I stepped out of the truck. I want to slow down right here, because this is the part of the whole thing that actually matters more than any fire ever could. Marcus stood up first and asked if he could carry my bag inside for me, and it struck me that the last time he'd carried a bag of mine anywhere, he'd been about 11 years old. Renee said she'd made coffee using Sandra's old recipe. It didn't taste quite the same. We both actually laughed about that, and it was the first real smile either one of us had managed since the funeral. Inside, the kitchen counters were already covered in casseroles and sympathy cards from people I barely remembered meeting over the years. Marcus finally just came out and said it, that they'd found the notebooks. I told him I figured that day would come around eventually. He asked if I'd let them find it on purpose. I told him it belonged to their mother, and it was never really mine to hide from either of them. We sat down together at the same dining table where Sandra had hosted 30-some Thanksgivings over the years. No television running, no phones out, just coffee going cold in front of three people finally willing to say the harder things out loud to each other. Marcus asked why I never told him about the boat. I told him that helping him out wasn't supposed to turn into one more thing he had to carry around on his shoulders. Renee asked why I'd let her go on, believing we simply wanted a smaller house. I told her Sandra wanted her to keep some dignity after the divorce. Nothing more complicated than that. Then Marcus finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting on him since the interview aired. Why hadn't I told the truth on camera? Why hadn't I let the whole world see exactly what he and his sister had said to me the night their uncle died? I told him that public humiliation doesn't heal a private wound, not really, and that Sandra never once believed in dragging people out just to watch them squirm over it. Accountability, she used to say, ought to lead somewhere. It shouldn't just leave a person standing there broken with nowhere left to go. Renee asked quietly if I'd been angry that night. I told her of course I had been. She said I hadn't looked angry at all on camera. I told her 36 years of marriage teaches a man that speaking while you're still furious just hands you a second mess to clean up come morning. A few days later, the three of us drove down together to the small memorial garden overlooking the river where Ray's ashes had been placed, right where he'd asked for them to go. Marcus apologized straight to the headstone, out loud, like Ray could actually hear him. Renee said she'd forgotten just how much I'd quietly been caring for the both of them all these years without a single complaint. I told them that most of parenting really just comes down to teaching your kids how to walk in the first place, and the hardest lesson left after that is teaching them how to walk back towards somebody when it counts. Marcus broke down completely right there, and it wasn't the stiff, quick hug grown sons give their fathers out of habit around the holidays. It was the kind of hug a frightened boy gives when he finally understands exactly how close he'd come to losing the one person who'd been quietly holding his whole life together the entire time. In the weeks that followed, Marcus started showing up Tuesday mornings with 2 cups of coffee from the gas station down the road, no particular reason given, just because he wanted to. Renee started coming by Thursday evenings with a pot of something that never quite tasted like Sandra's cooking. She admitted she was missing some ingredient she couldn't place. I told her the ingredient was patience, and Sandra had always sworn up and down it wasn't optional. My grandson Cole wandered into the garage one Saturday afternoon and asked if I could teach him how to build something with his hands. We spent the whole afternoon out there, putting together a lopsided little toolbox, and when he apologized for how crooked it turned out, I told him families are rarely perfect either, but so long as the foundation's solid underneath, they'll still stand through just about anything. A month or so later, the fire department asked if I'd come speak at a community safety event they were putting together. I almost turned it down flat. Then I remembered something Sandra used to tell me, that if your own hard experience can help even one other person out, it stops being just your own private story anymore. So I said yes to it. And near the end, somebody in the crowd asked me straight out what made me run toward those burning cars instead of running the other way like everybody else. I told them my wife spent almost 4 decades teaching me that when somebody you love is fighting for their life, you stop waiting around for somebody else to show up in your place. The real mistake most families make isn't usually one big dramatic betrayal. It's 1,000 small postponements stacked up over years, an unanswered call here, a canceled visit there, the quiet assumption that there's always going to be another chance down the road to make things right between you. Sometimes there just isn't. If there's one thing I genuinely ask you to actually go do today, not just sit there thinking about it, it's this. Call whoever it is you've been putting off calling. Not next week. Today, before you close out of this and move on with your evening, and ask yourself honestly, is there somebody in your life you've quietly gone ahead and assumed will always just be there to pick up the phone whenever you finally get around to it? Son, daughter, brother, sister, whoever you're picturing right now while I'm saying this, that's exactly who I mean. I'd genuinely love to hear from you all down in the comments tonight. Comment 1 if you think I was right to protect my own kids on camera the way I did. Comment 2 if you think the whole world deserved the plain truth instead. And comment 3 if you're honestly torn right down the middle the way I still am some nights. Tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it happens to be wherever you are right now, because it never stops amazing me how many different time zones end up sitting here with me in this same quiet moment. And if any part of this reminded you of your own family, son or daughter, mother or father, brother or sister. I'd love to hear that from you too. If this one meant something to you tonight, stay a while longer and consider subscribing, because I've got more stories like this one about the quiet sacrifices we don't ever seem to notice until it's almost too late to say so. Until next time, take care of yourself out there, and don't wait around for a headline to remind you who's been carrying you all along.